Welcome back. Now, believe it or not, I have a very little interest in a Rolex Submariner, which I know for some people is almost sacrilege. And it's not that I think it's a bad watch, quite the opposite. Maybe a little overpriced, but I think it's a fantastic piece. It's just I honestly find the Submariner, well, boring. It's kind of like a BMW 3 Series, which if you can afford it, is easily a fantastic car and one most people will be perfectly happy owning. It's been so good for so long, and depending on where you are, a lot of people have them, that at this point, it's really just a known quantity. So while I think it's a good car, I also think it's one that's rather boring to talk about. And I think the same thing can be said for the Rolex Submariner, especially here on YouTube, where there are so many videos talking about them, comparing them, or reviewing them. It's the same story told over and over and over again, almost to the point that I don't think there's really anything of value that can be added to it. So until there's a major update, I think the story's pretty much been told about the Rolex Submariner. Which brings us to today's watch, the Ginault Ocean Rover, which is a Submariner Homage, or as some people like to say, a Super Homage. And personally, I find the Ocean Rover much more interesting to talk about, which I know is also sacrilege for some people to hear. According to Ginault, the whole concept originated by wanting to create a Milspec Submariner Homage, which was a set of Submariners with some modifications created for the British military back in the 60s and 70s. They were never directly sold to the public, but they are highly sought after. Yet Ginault didn't just want to create a vintage Milspec homage. Instead, they approached it wondering what it would be like if Rolex created a new Milspec today, which is the idea they chased after, including trying to bring the quality as close as they possibly could to the standard that a modern Rolex would have today, which also led them to develop their own in-house movement, which is really just an ETA clone. The end result is the Ocean Rover, which almost winds up being a greatest hits of the Submariner's past, borrowing bits and pieces of various incarnations to create a dream Submariner, which to me is the beginning of a fascinating story. And it's a story that's still continuing, which is actually how I wound up doing this review. I heard that they were developing a new watch, so I emailed them to ask for some information for another video I'm thinking about doing. And I found out that the new watch is a follow-up to the Ocean Rover, which will be called the Ocean Rover II, which will look almost exact same as the current Ocean Rover, but with some internal changes. The Ocean Rover II won't be available until late this year, but they did offer to send me this one to review, which considering the price, is extremely generous, so I want to offer a huge thank you to Ginault. As for the Ocean Rover II, I will mention some of the differences as we go through this video, but the main changes will be a ceramic insert on the bezel and switching to a Solita movement over their own, which again, we'll talk more about later. And I believe they either are or will soon be taking pre-orders for the Ocean Rover II. So if you're actually interested in that, I'll have an email down below in the description that you can contact to find out more information. But this intro is already getting pretty long, so let's just jump right in and take a closer look at the Ocean Rover. The case shape of the Ocean Rover is modeled after the older 5-digit subs, which has a slimmer, narrower presence compared to the newer subs, which has a clearly defined presence, if not understated. The Ocean Rover is listed as being 40mm wide, but I think it might actually be closer to 39.5, at least without the bezel. With the crown, however, it's 44mm. Now, meanwhile, the lug-to-lug is just over 47, and it comes in just under 13mm thick. And that's 13mm without the Cyclops, with it's closer to 14. So the overall case shape is really a Goldilocks, as it's going to be just right for most people. Which honestly is one of the reasons that so many love the Submariner and its homages. Lug width here is 20mm, which matches the slimmer case shape compared to other divers. And even with its quite excellent bracelet, it's only 145 grams. If you're not familiar with Ginault, price may be a shocker here, as you usually don't expect an homage watch to be in this price range. Depending on the model, an Ocean Rover will run from around $12.99 all the way up to $14.99, which is where this one sits at. And I'll talk a little bit more about price later, but let me just say this here, that when it comes to watches in this price range and above, it's really all about the fine details, including details you don't actually see, such as who and where it's assembled. The fit and finish here is great, with expert care taken to ensure quality at every level. It's not perfect, however, as I did find a few flaws up close, as well as the bottom of the case at its edge and the lugs are a little sharp, but it's not too much. Overall, everything is just excellent. The Ocean Rover has a brushed finish over every texture, except for the sides of the case, which have a high polish mirror-like finish. And at this angle, you can really see the slim profile of that case, with just the case back coming slightly out underneath it. The case back itself is a screw down, done in a Rolex style. And style-wise, it's rather minimal, with just the relevant information. The crown is at the 3, and it is signed with Ginault's logo, and it is screw down as you would expect. The bezel is 120 click and unidirectional, and the action is really good. It just has a great tactile feel and sound, although with just a touch of backplay to it, but not much. While the bezel is good, I have to say that it's not the best I've ever seen, partially due to a little bit of wobble, where I can feel some play when I press down on the 12 and 6. It's not a lot, and it doesn't interfere with its use, but I do think it's a little disappointing for the price. The insert is aluminum with gold paint, and there is a Lume pip at the 12. Now, one criticism of the Ocean Rover is that at its price, it really should have a ceramic rather than an aluminum insert. And I did ask Ginault why they originally chose to go with aluminum, and basically they said it's a design choice, as they felt it was more appropriate and more fit with the vintage aesthetic of the case and a Milsub dial. Although that criticism has been heard, and the Ocean Rover II will have a ceramic insert, as well as an improved action of the bezel. What I do love, however, is this matte blue coloring on this model, as it creates a nice effect with the gold paint against the dark black enamel dial. And I think that look really sets this one apart from the standard, black on black subby homages out there. The crystal, as you would expect, is a flat sapphire, and this one does have a cyclops over the date. There is of course a no-date model with a domed crystal instead. And one thing I really love about this one is this off-white or yellowish tint on the date wheel, which I think goes well with the vintage coloring of the Lume. What I don't love, however, is how it actually interacts with that cyclops. While the cyclops does magnify the date, it also seems to just focus any light that's behind you, which I found often adds a real bit of glare when trying to read that date, which combined with that off-white background does make it kind of hard to read the date at times. If you're interested, my suggestion would be to go for the no-date version, or to ask them if they would remove the cyclops on the date one. As for the dial, there's a lot here that I really do love, as well as a few things I'm not too big a fan of. First off, the dial is this dark black enamel, and it is just magnificent looking. Although it can be a little challenging to film at times with the glare, there's just a lot of reflection going on. It is typical subby indices that are dots mixed with dashes, and here they are more of the Rolex maxi dial configuration with bigger indices than you would normally expect on this case. They are remarkably well made, with a good amount of depth to them. They have a nice metallic silver outline and filled with what Ginault refers to as gold sand lume, which when you really zoom in, it looks exactly like gold sand. It's just beautiful looking against the backdrop of that dial. And while this version does glow green, they do offer another version with more white colored indices that glows blue, or as they call it, a glowing smurf lume. We'll get back to that lume in a second, but you'll notice that the hands here are not typical Submariner, but rather sword-shaped, which is really in keeping with the Milspec sub design. And it's something that I prefer 100% over the typical Mercedes hands, and I can't stress that enough. The rest of the dial here really just follows a typical Submariner, with a painted chapter ring and a whole lot of text. And this is the part that I'm really not a fan of. And I think this is something that a lot of the other reviewers agree with. At the top, we have Ginault's logo and name, which is perfectly fine. But the rest is really just unnecessary. And in many ways, they're just trying to copy a subby's text, but kind of do it in their own way. And they really don't need to do that. Here, I think less would definitely be more, and it's better just to leave that dial clean, where you can really appreciate the quality of the craftsmanship, rather than say get distracted by the campiness of the text. The one text I do like, however, is at the very bottom. As Ginault says, they are a small microbrand made up of master watchmakers and expert machinists, so they try to make as much as internally as possible here in the United States, including the movement, which we will get to. Now, there is some controversy to this, and I don't really want to go into too much detail, but I guess I should a little, and now is as good a time as any. The short version is that not everyone believes their claims, especially when it comes to the movement. Some of it has to do with not having a Made in the USA moniker, and some of it has to do with a rather vocal minority really blowing things out of proportion, many of whom have never actually even touched an Ocean Rover. And if you ask Ginault, they'll openly admit that not everything is sourced from the US, so there's some key components that they just can't get here, but they try to do as much as they possibly can. So for me, this is really just a non-issue, as they're really facing the same issue that every other American watch company is facing, and that's that some components just can't be found here. And our government is a lot more strict than some other governments, where 100% of the watch needs to be sourced here in order to have a Made in the USA moniker. Versus, say, Switzerland, where it's just 60% of its value has to come from in-country. So US companies really just have to get more creative with their labeling. Overall, I really love the dial design here. It's beautiful black dial contrasting nicely with the vintage look of the gold sand lume, and all topped off with that matte blue insert with gold paint. It's really a great look that emphasizes the purpose of the watch, which is to be that of a tool rather than a fancier dress piece that some Submariners are used for. Anyway, let's move on to the lume, which is good, and I actually went on a very short camping trip and took the Ocean Rover with me. Well, at least my version of camping. So I can say firsthand that it gets instantly bright and it will definitely last through the night. But it's not quite as bright as I was hoping for. So here's a comparison test I did with a Seiko Turtle, as well as an Orient Kamasu, and a Hamilton Khaki King just for the heck of it. Now, while it's initially as bright, after 40 minutes, it is definitely the weakest out of those four. So as I said, the lume is still good, it's just the longevity of it is a little disappointing, especially for the price. Now on to the movement, which is Ginault's own caliber 7275, which should be high beat with around a 38-hour power reserve, and it does have hacking and hand winding. While most of the movement is fabricated locally, there are a few key components that are imported in from Switzerland and China before it's actually assembled here in the United States, which I think is one of the biggest things that actually attracted me to the Ocean Rover and Ginault. That they're really going the extra mile to create their own movement, and I think it really just makes this something special. And I think it's one of the largest justifications for their price. So it's a little disappointing that the Ocean Rover II is moving to a stock Solido movement, although I do understand their rationale. They're a rather small company, and manufacturing their own movement is a huge investment in time, and most likely the biggest bottleneck in their production line. So while it's a little disappointing, I can understand it from a business decision. Plus the Solido is also an ETA clone, so there really shouldn't be any functional difference. And they did mention that you can opt to get one of their 7275s in an Ocean Rover II, but I'm not sure if that's just a temporary thing or if it'll be a permanent option. Regardless, Ginault really goes the extra mile when it comes to regulating it. As included with the Ocean Rover is a test sheet showing the results of their process, where each watch is tested in 6 different positions over the course of 6 weeks. And this one resulted in an average of about negative 1.2 seconds per day after the end of that 6 weeks, which is actually pretty close to what I found it to be. Now the bracelet may be the best part of the Ocean Rover, as it's extremely well made and a real close approximation of a Rolex glide lock bracelet, which makes changing the size on the fly extremely easy. It's worth noting that the bracelet is not made in-house, but is actually imported from China, which is something I think they are working on changing. But regardless, it does fit the watch perfectly, and has a great fit and finish. It starts out at 20mm, but then slowly tapers down as it comes to the glide lock-like clasp. And at first, that clasp is just a little stiff, but after a day or so, it was really broke in and moves nicely. I'd say this bracelet on its own is easily worth $150 to $200. And the only area that I noticed was a little rough and could be improved upon was on the very inside of the clasp. Now the Ocean Rover II is listed as having an improved bracelet, which I'd be really surprised to see as this one is pretty good as it is. And wearing the Ocean Rover on that bracelet is also a joy, and I really understand why people love their Submariners. Its long but thin clasp really helps keep the watch perfectly balanced where it's supposed to be, and it's extremely easy to loosen it or tighten it as the situation demands, as well as being rather minimal and just really comfortable, especially in hotter weather. While the dial is beautiful and clear and just easy to read, the crystal here could use some air coating, but I think that's also something coming to the Ocean Rover II. As I said earlier, I really don't have any interest in a Rolex Submariner, and even after this, I still don't. But after wearing the Ocean Rover off and on for the last month, I can say that I definitely have a more appreciation of it, and I do understand why some obsess over it. Even if they are a bit overpriced, they really are a bit of a Goldilocks watch. That it's evolved over the decades to be just a great fit for most people, and has a great balance of both durability, comfort, and elegance, which is really one of the reasons that there are so many homages out there. As for the Ocean Rover itself, I really think it's a fantastic piece, and I just love the idea of making and trying to perfect a modern-day Milspec. And while it may be an homage, it's not an homage to a specific watch. It's more of a greatest hits, designed and built with the best elements of Submariner's past, to create almost a dream Submariner for some people. The biggest question, of course, is price, which is rather high. And honestly, I'm not really the best person to really do comparisons at this price level, or to even tell you why it's so much better than a Steinhardt. And along the same lines, at this price, I don't think you should ever just take one person's word for it, especially from a small micro brand. So if you're really serious about getting an Ocean Rover or an Ocean Rover II, I'll put some links down below that'll be other reviews that I think are worth checking out. I can tell you, however, that I think it's a great watch, and that I think the quality is really there, even if there are some things that I think should be improved. Although I should note that some of those, like the text on the dial, are also on a Rolex Submariner, and I never really hear anyone criticize it there. The bigger question, however, is whether I would actually buy one, or more importantly, buy an Ocean Rover II. And the answer is yes, but with a huge but. And I know that kind of sounds like a cop-out, but let me explain. The thing is, I really like it, and I really love the idea of it, especially it being assembled here in the USA. The trick is that there are a lot of watches in the $500 to $1,500 price range that I'm interested in. And with this channel, I need to be careful about what I buy, as I can't buy everything. So there are a lot of watches that I'd wind up buying first, almost to the point that I'm not really sure I'd ever actually get around to buying an Ocean Rover II. The only exception to that would be if I really wanted to focus on having an American collection, in which case that would change my priorities. I would also like to see Ginault use their skills to create more original pieces. Now, back in 2011, they showed this off, and they never really made it, which is basically just a blacked out version of a Milspec. Personally, I think it's rather cool, and I'd love it if they revisited it. But if they are going to stay on this track, another suggestion I'd like to offer is a GMT version. Personally, I think a high-quality, American-assembled Milspec GMT master would be something I would be highly interested in. Now, one final thing I want to talk about is who the Ocean Rover is actually for, or its ideal customer. And I think this is something that some of its critics actually get wrong. As I've heard it said that, like many homages, it's a watch for someone that wants a Submariner but can't actually afford one. So they just settle for something less. And while that may be true for some other homages, I don't think it's true for the Ocean Rover. I don't think Ginault built it with the idea of stealing Rolex customers. Rather, I think they built it with current Rolex customers in mind. But let me put it this way. If a Rolex Submariner is your grail watch, then I don't think you're really going to settle for anything less. Part of the reason for wanting to own a Submariner is you want to own a Rolex, as that's the summit you are trying to climb. So I don't think they're really going to settle for anything else, even if the quality comes pretty close. They might even be willing to buy a Steinhardt just to try it out. But at the Ocean Rover's price, I think they're more willing to just save up for the real thing. I think the Ocean Rover's ideal customer is someone with a high expendable income who is willing to buy a watch sight unseen from a very small microbrand. And I think it's someone who already owns a Submariner, and since they've already climbed that summit, they really have nothing to prove, either to themselves or anyone else. So here, they're willing to take a risk. Perhaps because they're curious about the claims of quality, or they just love the idea of getting a good Milspec sub. And that's who I think the ideal Ocean Rover customer is. I think it's a watch made by Rolex fans for Rolex fans. Anyway, let me know in the comments what you think about the Ginault Ocean Rover, and if you'd actually be willing to spend this much on a watch you've never seen in person. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me, and hope to see you soon.